Hello, and welcome back to Who Do You Say I Am? Encountering the Newer Testament. We are thrilled to be here today with Professor Margaret Aymer, who is Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dean of Faculty, and the First Presbyterian Church of Shreveport, D. Thomason Professor of New Testament Studies at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. We are so delighted to have you with us today.
So well done. That title is a mouthful, and you've done that beautifully.
All right. Thank you. First job.
Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. And we are here today to talk about the letter of James. We are so excited to be having this conversation with you. We know this is a book that you love and have done a great deal of in-depth work on. In our context, James might have kind of I don't know if I want to say a bad reputation, but, famously Martin Luther called James an epistle of straw, and took issue with some of the language about, faith without works being dead. Can you sort of redeem James for us a little bit in our largely Lutheran context? Help us understand what's happening sort of theologically with that faith works distinction here, and also, what this letter has to add to our Newer Testament canon.
Yeah, so James is an interesting little book, and bless Luther, he was asking a question that James was not answering. And I think part of the reason he found James an epistle of straw is that he was asking a question that James really did not have on James's radar, whoever James was. We go back and forth as to whether James was actually written by the apostle or not. It's probably pseudonymous, but there's evidence that it certainly comes from a tradition of the brother of Jesus. This whole faith without works question in James is something that I think Calvin would say is an impossibility, that faith can't be without works. That faith can't exist without works, just like an angel can't be anathema to God. But it is such a ridiculous proposition that the author is putting forward to say you're going to do this, say you're going to claim faith has no works, then that is not really faith. That's just a sophistry, right? Mm-hmm. Luther is trying to answer the question, do I need to do anything to be saved? Mm. That's not the question James is trying to answer. James is trying to answer the question, what does it mean to live as a disciple? And to live as a disciple, James assumes that the people in the congregation are already saved. James assumes, I think, a more mature Christian than Paul does. Paul is writing to Gentiles who are trying to figure out what it means to be a Christian. Can I be part of this covenant of Moses? Can I be part of this promise of God? James is assuming everyone in this context already gets that. He's saying, if you claim to be part of this covenant, but you're not acting like you're part of this covenant, then you are like a body without breath. You're like a corpse. Wow. That the works that you do in response to your faith are the same thing as the breath that runs in your body. Mm. And if you're not working, you're not breathing.
So what are those works then? What are those marks of discipleship or ways of acting as if you do have faith, as if you are part of this covenant? What are James's main emphases?
But James has a number of different emphases, and he kind of puts together an image of life together as a body of Christ. In fact, James became a favorite book of monastics because a lot of monastic rule is based around the kind of community that James imagines. First of all, that faith requires a reliance on a very large understanding of who God is. For James, God is the Father of lights, the giver of every good gift, the birth parent of the church. Literally, James says in one of the most interestingly gendered texts that God gave birth to us. God gave birth to the church. So God is, unlike the Roman Catholic tradition, where Mary is the birth giver, the mother of God, the Theotokos, in James, God is the birther. of the faithful, right? So part of that work is believing and trusting and relying on this very big God and understanding that it is to God we turn, not to the world, not to people with power, but to God we turn for all good things. A second part of that is being aware of how you speak. How one speaks is an ongoing theme throughout James. It's highlighted in chapter 3, but you see it in all sorts of other places. In chapter 2, if what you're saying to one of your brothers is sit underneath my feet, that's also about speech. If you're bringing something to court, that's also about speech. If you're not letting your yes be yes and your no be no, that's also about speech. It's not simply about slandering each other, as we see in chapter 3, but James cares deeply about how you use your mouth and what you do with your mouth. And he not only gives negative examples at the end, in the middle of the book, he also gives positive examples at the end of the book. Anyone who is joyful, let them sing. Anyone who is in need, let them pray. So these are the positive ways to use your tongue. So James cares about how and what we speak, which is an interesting to think about in this social media world, where speech is ever abundant and all over the place. How and what we speak, what we say, and how we speak about one another, for James, is part of the way we breathe out our faith. It's part of the way we show that our faith is alive. Then James has a passion for the poor. And people know of James because James's passion for the poor. We see this again in chapter 1, where he mentions widows and orphans, taking care of widows and orphans in their distress. In chapter 2, we see him talking about a poor person coming into the community being treated less than somebody with prestige and power. One scholar suggests that person might actually have been running for office, and in that white toga, trying to get the votes from people that may have had votes. And James is saying, if you treat that candidate for office better than you treat the beggar who comes in your door, then your faith is dead. And similarly, James cares about those who are poor within the community of faith. If you have people in the community of faith that need something, and you're not reaching out to care for them, your faith is dead. But also James cares about justice. So not only how you treat one another one-on-one, but how you treat your workers. Chapter 5 is all about not giving your workers fair pay. If you are withholding the wages of the worker, James says their voices go up to the Lord of Sabaoth, the Lord of armies, right? The God who controls the armies of heaven hears the cries of the workers who are being unjustly compensated, whose wages are being withheld. So how you treat the poor, how you treat those who are below you, matters deeply to James. Another thing that James cares about is how you position yourself with regards to the world. And James doesn't fully define what James means by the world, but we get inklings of it from the letter. The world is that which promises you that it can give you all your needs. And James is saying, if that is not God, you're turning your eyes to the world. The world is that which upholds the people with power and authority and says that the rich are worthy of more prestige than the poor. That is the world for James. The world is made of teachers who blather on because they want to hear their own voice. And I'm talking about myself now, probably. But that is the world to James. The world is made of those who are so sure that they control their own destiny that they don't even say, if God wills, I will do this. They just lay out what their plans are as if they themselves are not mortal. The world causes you to envy and want other people's things to the point where sometimes it even leads to violence. The world invites you to cheat those who have no power. And James invites us to turn away from that world, literally calls us to repentance from that world, to turn toward God. So those are some of the concerns and the considerations of the letter of James.
Do you think it matters who the audience was? I know it's hard to tell. We can tell so much more from a book like First Corinthians or something like that. We get 5 chapters. This is the only writing. What do we know about the people reading this? You said they might be more mature in their faith. It sounds like some of them have the capacity to hire people and maybe own land and things like that. But
Right.
how much does that matter, do you think, for James's message?
I think anybody who's a good pastor is thinking about who they're preaching to, right? And I think one of the most important things to understand James's message is that James seems to be speaking to people who get the law, who get the Torah, who get the scriptures of Israel, who are steeped in what James calls the royal law. Whatsoever you would do to other people, have other people do unto you, do ye also unto them. For this is the law and the prophets. James seems to be expecting a people that is steeped in that, but a people who are tempted to become more like the world. So these seem to be people who are between two cultures, who are deeply rooted in their Judaism, but like Shia Cohen mentions, are increasingly indistinguishable from Romans, indistinguishable from Greeks. A lot of the work about early first century Judaism is that you couldn't tell a Jew from a Gentile by looking. They didn't dress differently, they didn't speak differently, they didn't act particularly differently, except for specific things like keeping Sabbath, specific things like not eating pork, or if you happen to see a male Jew naked. But you would have to have a reason to see a male Jew naked, right? This is not something.
Doesn't Cohen say nobody's lifting up togas?
Nudists, people weren't nudists. So Jews and Gentiles looked and were very much like each other. And James does not seem to be writing at a time when, say, Jews were being persecuted by the Romans and being kicked out of an area, like you see in Paul's letter to the Romans. So Jews were indistinguishable from everybody else. And the temptation is to go along and get along. The temptation is not to live out a Christian faith that distinguishes yourself so from the rest of the world. And James is saying, even if you look like everyone else, even if you have power, you have a call to live out your faith in such a way that it is still alive. Because if you live like everyone else, you are letting your faith expire. Even if you're not worshiping idols, James doesn't care about worshiping idols. James is not worried about that. Even if you're just going and doing all the good things, you're a worshiper of God, you go to the appropriate services, you're part of the community. But if the way you live your life does not reflect what it is you say you believe, then you're just going through the motions. You're just carrying a corpse around.
So this is a question that we ask actually of each book, and I think this might be a really interesting one with James in particular. But with each of these texts that we read, we ask, who is Jesus in this text? How would you approach that question for this letter?
Yeah, James is probably one of the hardest letters to talk about who Jesus is. But it seems as though there are hints of the Jesus story in James. James says nothing about the crucifixion. James says nothing about the life of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, the death of Jesus. And that also may be a reason why Luther had a problem with James. James does not mention the cross, right? Paul mentions the cross all the time. James does not mention the cross. But what James does mention is what some scholars call the parousia, the coming of the Christ, that the judge is at the gate, that the coming is near. So for James, it seems that the way in which the Christ is mentioned is through the teachings of the Christ, which are present, and how you treat one another, and letting your yes be yes and your no be no seems to be coming right out of Jesus. Some of the teachings of James seem to be coming out of the gospel traditions, but also in the sense that there's an Advent theology in James, an eschatological expectation that the judge is at the gate, which is why we are called to be patient, because it is coming. Christ is coming. And God's judgment, God's day of the Lord is coming. James calls himself a servant, a slave of Christ. So James understands Christ as the background for what he's doing and for what he's saying. He just doesn't need to explicate on his theology of Christ, because that may not be the question at stake. You know, it's like saying to somebody, well, you didn't say X. You didn't say anything about motorcycles when the question was about trucks. You know, James is not interested in talking about the cross, the death, the resurrection, because that does not seem to be the question his audience is grappling with.
Do you think James has a lot to say about how one lives, right? It's and you've talked about how it's steeped in Torah, it's steeped in Jewish law, it has connections to Jesus's teachings. What makes it theological? In other words, how is this more than just good ideas for getting along or good ways to be compassionate?
It's theological because everything James is asking us to do is connected to who God is.
Okay.
We start the letter with who God is and what our relationship is to God, or should be to God. All of the rest of the teachings of James stem out of this sense of and rely on this sense of who God is to us and what our relationship is to God. We are not taking each other to court. We are not judging one another, because we are not the judge. We are not the lawgiver. God is the judge. God is the lawgiver. And that may not be said explicitly, but it is implied in how James speaks and what James says. We do not go looking to other people for gifts. We do not envy and follow the world, because the giver of all good gifts is God, who gave the community birth. And so when we are joyful, our voices go to God. When we are in need, our voices go to God. When we are sick, the elders come and bring us to God. God is underlying and framing all of James' ethics. And further, when we are tempted by the world and find ourselves in that space where we are full of envy and we are full of greed, James calls us to repentance, calls us to humble ourselves before God, and God will lift us up. So on underlying James's ethics, it's not simply a book of this is the good stuff you need to do. And this is what differentiates James from, say, Proverbs. These are not aphorisms for living. This is one of the things that some of the earliest commentators on James got wrong, because they were Lutherans and they had decided that this was an epistle of straw. These are not just aphorisms for living. These are responses to who God is and to our relationship with God.
Can you say something about what it's like when that relationship is disordered? That phrase of what gets translated in my Bible as double-mindedness. You know, what's the danger here? What's that condition like for a person, and what are the attendant dangers of that?
So double-mindedness in James is wanting both to have your center, your cause, your reason, that's going to be the world, and wanting it to be God at the same time. And the difficulty is, if you can't trust God over the world, then you end up constantly being pulled against God's interests. Because for James, God and the world are fundamentally separate. And this is one of the places Matthew asked me when we were preparing about this, about my my stuff on migration and how that ties into James. So I'm going to get a little bit heady for a minute.
Do it.
There's a philosopher, psychologist named John Berry, and he talks about how migrants interact with the culture they come from, their home culture, and with the culture they end up in, their host culture. And some migrants, especially those who are coming from very dangerous places, may say, I want nothing to do with my home I just want to be in my host culture. We saw that, say, in New Braunfels here in Texas, when you had Germans coming over to New Braunfels. And there's a story of a German POW who was brought over here, escaped, and just hid out in the New Braunfels area and pretended not to be a German. He pretended to be a German from New Braunfels, forgot his whole culture, forgot his whole background, did not contact his family. He just focused in on that host culture. That's one option. The opposite of that is someone who says, everything about the outside world is bad. I'm just going to turn in on myself and focus on my home culture. You might think about the Amish or a monastic community, right? That's turning itself inward and not focusing out on the world. And then there are others who straddle that. James tends to be on that monastic side. James tends to see the world as a dangerous thing to faith, as a thing that can kill one's faith, as a thing that can destroy one's reliance on God, which is why James is such a favorite book among monastic traditions, because it's calling people away from the world. It's calling people to focus in on their relationship with God and to focus on the community of faith and how we treat one another. How that plays out in 21st century society is we need to think about, if we don't live that way, what can we learn from those who turn away from the world? What are the dangers we need to be aware of if we have to live between the world and God? And how can James help us to temper our tendency to lean too far in the other direction? That help?
Yeah, absolutely.
It strikes me as a conversation that's going to become more and more prevalent in churches, in certain churches, right? In terms of how do we see ourselves as ingrained with the systems and the values and the norms of a culture, and how much do we deliberately position ourselves as a counter society, right, or a counter voice, and who the we there is matters so much depending upon what kind of a church you're talking about, right, and who goes and where you're situated.
I would argue it's always been a conversation in the church.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for some particularly progressive churches in this political season, it's becoming more of a conversation than perhaps it had been in the past. But I would argue if you grew up in the Black church of the segregated South, it was always a question. Mm-hmm. If you grew up in the Waldensian church in France, it was always a question. If you grew up in the church in China that has been persecuted, or in Pakistan that has been persecuted, it has always been a question. If you grew up in apartheid South Africa as a Christian, it has always been a question. The church has always had to ask this question. It's just different churches ask it at different seasons. And I would also argue that evangelical churches have been asking this question, and they come to different conclusions than, say, progressive churches do, but they're still asking the same question. The question itself is valid. The answers will differ, but the question itself is still valid, because ultimately the temptation is to put our hopes and our dreams and our worship, even though we don't realize it's worship, outside of God. And that's always the temptation. It's a temptation if you're in exile. It is the temptation if you're not in exile. It is a temptation if you are on the wrong end of power. It is a temptation if you're on the best end of power and you have all the power in your hand. And James is speaking to those who are tempted not to rely on the Father of lights, who are tempted to think of themselves as something other than mortal, to think of themselves as the judges and the rulers, rather than understanding that God is the lawgiver and God is the judge.
That's really helpful.
I think we've got time for one more question.
One more?
I know, right? I know. We knew the time was
now. This is my book.
Gonna fly. Yes. Matt, do you have one? Or would you like me to?
You're welcome to go ahead.
Sure. So I'm curious about the relationship between this, what you've sort of described as this sort of this inward turn in James, like not getting too sort of comfortable with being out there in the world, but also this move towards care for the outsider who comes into the community, care for the poor. I mean, what's the relationship between that kind of economic vision of James and that question of how much should we be turning towards the world or not?
I think the connection is Torah. Particularly, I think the connection is Leviticus 19. I am somewhat convinced that James is a reflection or a midrash on the Leviticus 19, particularly the parts of Leviticus 19 that lead to love your neighbor as yourself. Because Leviticus 19 includes care of the stranger. Leviticus 19 includes making sure your workers have the right wages. So the piece here is James is deeply, but not explicitly, grounded in Scripture, grounded in the scriptural tradition and the scriptural teaching of the people. That being a faithful person, a faithful worshiper of God who made heaven and earth, means that you are required to do good to the poor, that you are required to treat your workers fairly, that you are required to be good to the foreigner among you and the stranger among you. That's in the Bible. And as I always tell my students, James doesn't have the New Testament.
Right.
For him, the Bible is Torah, it's Septuagint. That's in the Bible.
That's beautiful.
We're gonna have to tell people to go back to our session well over a year ago on Leviticus now.
On Leviticus, yes. Yeah, I think we did talk about Leviticus 19. We got there, but I love that connection point. And it did not occurred to me to think of of James as a midrash on that text, but that is absolutely beautiful. And I love that connection, of the tradition of the community and that question of how does the community relate to its neighbors, especially those who are most marginalized or most in need. That is a fantastic place to come to an end here. Thank you so much, Professor Aymer, for being with us and for this conversation. It has been a real gift and a joy.
Well, it's a delight to me. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Margaret.
You're welcome, Matt.